all therapists were expected to be as up to speed on sexual minority issues as we now expect them to be on gender issues. Yes, there is much work still to be done in the gender area, but therapists who are not alive to gender issues at some level are, we know, out of touch. What I'm saying is kind of similar, that therapists who do not know what is happening in the sexual minorities area are crap therapists. Yes, this is a rhetorical point and a political point, but it's much more than that, because there is a methodology at work here, and it's one that I've actually been pursuing since the early 1980s. And I'll give examples of other areas where I've used this methodology I'm about to explain, if you want, in the discussion or somehow during the day. I don't want to focus on my own work in other areas for the moment, but I have been thinking about what I'm about to tell you for a very long time. The talk today is my very small contribution to what I see as perhaps the most compassionate major intellectual project of the past 100 years, which is the huge attempt to grasp the relations between the center of the world of lived social and emotional experience and the margins of it. The relations between the center and the margins of the world of lived experience. Now, you'll associate that with Foucault, but there's much more to it than Foucault, and one might at this point pause to mourn the passing of Jacques Derrida as well. Now, just so you know what I'm talking about, because you probably do, but I want to be sure. This compassionate, ambitious, intellectual and social project shows how the margins secretly define and construct the center. Criminal secretly defines law-abiding citizen. Woman secretly defines man. Homosexual secretly defines heterosexual. Jew secretly defines German. Even, and I'm absolutely serious, humanistic psychotherapy or Jungian analysis secretly defines psychoanalysis. But my particular take on this project is, I think, much more idealistic and I believe more benign. It's certainly more active. I want to do more than simply note how it is that the margins define and hence indirectly support the centre. I'm interested in what the margins can teach the centre, what the centre can learn from the margins. This is what I mean by benign and active. To use a woefully inappropriate biblical tag, the stone that the builder rejected hath become the cornerstone of the temple. There's a parallel that I just want to leave you with, which is from the world of literature, English literature, in which works from Ireland between about 1880 and 1930, or works from India closer to our own time, have refreshed the field of English literature. The subaltern colonial world, the marginal world, has impacted positively and challengingly on what goes on in London. That's the basic method here. It is political, it is rhetorical, it's also intellectual, and now I want to show you how it's clinical. To illustrate what I've just been saying, I've teased out three themes. I don't use PowerPoint. What I try to do is give a memorable tag to each of the major areas of a talk. And the three themes that I've teased out, they're supposed to be snappy. First one is, who's that therapist? The second one is, men under scrutiny. And the third one is, la lucha continua, Spanish for the struggle goes on. Who's that therapist? Now this tag, who's that therapist, is a little homage to Jack Drescher, who, when writing the foreword to the new edition of our mutual friend Lynn Layton's wonderful book, Who's That Girl, Who's That Boy, entitled his foreword, Who's That Analyst? And so I've borrowed it and turned it into Who's That Therapist? This is a series of books that Jack edits called the Bending Psychoanalysis series. Wonderful title. So who is that therapist? Who's the therapist? If you read, now don't take this personally. If you read this brochure, you will find it contains a wholly appropriate and absolutely inevitable mix of beautiful clarity and utter confusion in its thinking. It can't be otherwise. Because if we're asking and answering the question, who's that therapist, there is a huge area of unknowing. Who are we? Lesbians, gay, bisexuals, straight, psychoanalytic, Jungian, humanistic, integrative, working with such and such a client load. These questions are on the agenda, and I think that it's work in the sexual minorities areas that have driven what has now become a relentless focus on the personal situation, the subject position, to use the jargon, of the therapist that would not have been imaginable 10 years ago. So when I say it's brilliantly clear, it is, it's very careful, it's politically adept, it's also confused, and it has to be confused. But owning confusion is a good thing, and the confusion in my tag question, who's that therapist, is one that I believe the majoritarian world of psychoanalysis, Jungian analysis, integrative psychotherapy needs to start to pay much more attention to. Sexuality is, of course, the area where lesbian, gay, and bisexual writers have made a contribution out of all proportion to their numbers in the last quarter of a century. They have put sexuality back on the therapeutic agenda. And this came up last night, and the chap asked a question, in effect asking, where's sexuality gone? And I wanted to try to answer this in this section on who's that therapist. I don't know if he's here, but the paper I mentioned is up here if you want to come and get it afterwards. It's called From Sexual Misconduct to Social Justice. And what I say in this paper, and what I want to say today, and I learnt it partly from gay men, friends and colleagues of mine, especially the late David Curry, who died about 10 years ago, is this. The institutions of psychotherapy, which discovered sexuality in its modern form, have repressed it. And they've done this by what I call maternocentrism. Maternocentrism lies at the heart of object relations approaches to psychotherapy. And if you follow an object relations line in psychotherapy, whilst it's not necessarily the case that it absolutely has to evacuate sexuality from what you do, it will tend in that direction. I also think that there's a tremendous fear which is stoked in the wider culture by fears around sexual abuse. There's a tremendous, and I'll return to this later, there's a tremendous fear that if you enter the sexual areas, it could go wrong. And if it goes wrong, given the manic levels of activity of ethics committees these days, you could be in deep doo-doo. But if you're working in a sexual minority context, you simply can't afford to dissolve everything into a milky Weltanschauung. You simply can't afford to worry about what the ethics committee might say if somebody launches a totally fraudulent complaint against you. You absolutely have to work with sexuality, your own and the client's, and indeed the sexiness, the ineluctable fundamental sexiness that the intimacy of the therapy encounter produces. You can't cut it out. In fact, when I'm supervising, and I've talked to other people who are fairly experienced supervisors as well, the question now is, why isn't the sex stuff there? Not why is the sex stuff there? And the task is to engage with sex as sex, not sex as a secondary eroticization of feeding or shitting or what have you. Slippery, frightening, ecstatic, lusty sex. Now I want to broaden this because I'm talking about the subject position of the therapist. Who is that therapist? And I want to broaden it to say something about the abuse of countertransference in the literature, in the theory, especially in this country. Those of you who don't know the British scene will perhaps not plug into this as directly as those, the majority of course, who do. Basically, the way it works here, the way we've all been taught, is that there's unconscious to unconscious communication, and so communications from the unconscious of the client pop up in, crop up in, appear in the mind of the therapist. The therapist recognizes that these are not to do with her or him and studies them with a view to comprehending what the inner world situation of the client is. It was a liberating step away from seeing countertransference as essentially the therapist's neurosis. And Jack gave an example of that kind of thing last night with Mr. F, where certain ideas and phrases that Mr. F had in his mind in a session but didn't reveal cropped up in Jack's. There's a problem with this, a political problem and a clinical problem. Because, and we all have a phrase for this that hasn't yet found a real theoretical standing, there's a peg, isn't there, for these communications? We do something as part of this so-called unconscious to unconscious communication. We, the therapists. This is what I've learned from reading, for example, Gilbert Cole, who's written a wonderful book about what it means to work as an HIV-positive psychoanalyst. We do something to the client. It's not a pure situation where we pick up something from the client. So who we are matters now, at this point in the history of psychotherapy, more than it ever has before. Jung had a tag for this, forgive his expression. It's the man that heals and not the method. It's the person, it's the therapist. Who she or he is matters more. And I want to say this absolutely clearly here today. Character, integrity, having a benign and loving attitude towards people, being able to manage your retaliatory impulses, these matter more than pieces of paper and degrees. The next thing I want to say in this who's that therapist, who's this therapist, is that focusing on the therapist brings in the question of all the different kinds of difference there are between therapist and client. Sexual, socioeconomic, ethnic, national, and characterological or typological differences. We start to look at how social and cultural differences enter the interpersonal and intrapsychic fields of the psychotherapy encounter. And this enables us now, and this I've also learned from people working in the sexual minorities area, to address questions of power in the therapy relationship more acutely than we have ever been able to do before. The second tag was men under scrutiny. To summarize what's happened in the world of those who study men, if not yet in the world of men, I like the image of the papal balcony, you know, where the Pope goes on Easter Sunday and blesses the city and the world. Men have been on the papal balcony studying, scrutinizing the world for thousands and thousands of years, until about 100 years ago, people started to study men. Now there were two groups of people who broke the taboo on the male vantage point from which men looked at women, children, blacks, the natural world, and the like. One group was criminologists, the other group were people working in areas to do with sexuality. And I think that there are some contributions to how we understand men, how we understand masculinity, coming from the general area of working with sexual minorities that are quite riveting for those of us who maybe don't work very much with people from sexual minorities. Psychotherapy has simply not achieved its potential in relation to understanding men. I want to give a quick example of this. I think that our understandings now of the father and his role in the development of the individual have radically shifted thanks to work done in the sexual minorities area. The time when one studied the father as a secondary phenomenon is past. By the secondary phenomenon, I mean this. You look at father as a contrast to mother. Or you look at father who's absent. That terribly arch phrase that makes me want to vomit, that we have to consider the presence of the absent father. All of this clever stuff stops us looking at the presence of the present father, and in particular, and my focus as a man is on men here, one could make, I suppose, a similar point or similar talk about women. One of the things we're beginning to understand about the father-son relationship is that in the broader sense it is a profoundly homoerotic relationship. We can move beyond Freud's restricting, self-castrating vision of intergenerational relations as only being about rivalry, competition, and murder. If you look at the father-son relationship with a homosexualized eye, what you see is that there is nothing malign about an appropriate degree of bodily excitation passing between the two of them. We lack positive texts about paternal erotics. It's right to worry about the negative aspects of paternal erotics, and I would not for 1 minute suggest that we stop looking into and doing something about sexual abuse perpetrated by men. However, there is something wrong when a community of psychotherapists worldwide has so little to say about positive paternal erotics and the positive use of the father's body in his relationship with his son. The only possible basis for a new text about the benign action of the father's body is a text that has some comprehension of the benign behavior of two men's bodies in some kind of congress. You won't find that in the heterosexual world. My last point, 20 minutes isn't very long. My last point, 25 minutes isn't very long. La lucha continua. The struggle goes on. Look, one of the things that people working in sexual minority areas tell those of us who are not doing it full time, so to speak, is that an awful lot of theory is plain prejudice dressed up in a fancy way. We've learned this from critiques of all kinds of theories done by lesbian and gay writers. Such writers have made me see that the binary homo-hetero is itself quite problematic and reflects a whole bundle of prejudices. But I want to do something more to illustrate that I'm on a learning curve. I want to tell you what I think some of the hot prejudices infecting psychotherapeutic theory in Britain, and I suspect in other countries, happen to be today. You see, the Socarides campaign to end discrimination or the barring of lesbian and gay applicants for training produced non-discrimination clauses and all relevant documentation. I'm not so stupid, and I don't want you people to be so stupid as to think it changed very much on the ground, and it certainly hasn't changed one jot or tittle, if I could use that expression, what is actually taught in the places whom the government forced to put non-discrimination clauses on their pieces of paper. Therapy thinking continues to radiate prejudice, and here are some of the ways in which I'm attuned to it at the moment. There are 4, and then I will stop. First, there is a very strong temptation to divide the sexual minority field into good gays and bad gays. Now, I got this insight, as I have got so many, from Chess Denman, who isn't here. She threw it out one day, and I've taken it up. I'm really looking forward to her talk later. A good gay is defined by having been in a one-to-one relationship for a long time. If you can show that you've been, it doesn't matter how awful the relationship, it doesn't even matter. doesn't. I'm going to get into trouble for the next one. It doesn't even matter if it's true. But if you want to give advice to a young person who wants to do a psychotherapeutic training, I would say, invent a marriage, quick. This is the sort of clumsy, ignorant liberalism at work. You can get in if you look like what we would like ourselves to be. Never mind the fact that half the analysts I know are either divorced and haven't had a fuck for years.
Only half?
Yeah, only half. Now for the bad gays, and this is the second of the four possibilities. The bad gays are the ones who want everything. In particular, they want to be allowed to parent together. Same-sex parenting excites, in a negative vein, the psychotherapy world like nothing else. When we had the celebratory, Mary Lynn will remember, the so-called celebratory conference in Cambridge following that Socarides campaign, it actually fell apart. The liberal multitude who came, even more than this, got hooked on what it would do to the emerging sexual identities of children who were raised in same-sex relationships. And I don't want to go into that anymore, except that this is brought up all the time as an example of something wrong, some wrong claim, some wrong-headed claim, some immoral claim being made by people who belong to sexual minorities. And these are the bad gays, not just the ones not in relationships, but the ones who are in relationships and make these naughty claims. Another example of bad gays is reflected in the appalling prejudice about lesbian relationships that they're somehow sexless. Now, there are problems and issues which writers about lesbian experience touch on, and no doubt they will touch on them in today's conference. But somehow out there, in the wider world of psychotherapy, there is still the idea that lesbians don't basically come. Which means that, and this is very important, because orgasmic fulfillment still, since Freud and still, operates very powerfully in the minds of Freudian-influenced therapists. So if they can construct lesbians as people who don't discharge, who don't have discharge, then there's going to be something wrong with them, willy-nilly. Oh dear. Finally, cottaging. Cottaging is used to settle arguments in the psychotherapy field all the time. It is sometimes described as the definite article, homosexual lifestyle. And I want to say this as a heterosexual man who is no better than he ought to be. This has got to stop. Heterosexuals are promiscuous and unfaithful. Heterosexuals, if you like the word perversion, indulge in perversions. Heterosexuals use prostitutes. Heterosexuals devour pornography. Heterosexuals, as you will have seen on the TV in the last few days, buy sex slaves knowingly from the sources in Eastern Europe. So when somebody starts to say the problem with gay men is they just go to bars or toilets or Hampstead Heath or car parks or wherever it happens to be to get sex, one has to start to say, what are you comparing this with in your mind? Are things so squeaky clean, so Church of England approved in the straight area? Summary. I'll just read it. I explained that I want the centre to learn from the margins, and I've been giving examples of what we can learn from the margins, where some of the best, most acute, most sensitive and most sophisticated work in psychotherapy is going on. I've been looking at the person of the therapist, whom I want to bring back centre stage, inspired by people working with sexual minorities so to do. I think that issues to do with men and fathering cannot be taken further without input from homosexuals. And finally, I've been looking at the way in which prejudice still continues to mould, shape, and inform psychotherapy theory. Thank you.